Today we have a single story for you because Nintendo is going after, maybe going after is the wrong word. They're playing favorites. That is the accusation being made in a new article at GameIndustry.biz that Nintendo is playing favorites with indie developers, and they have a reason for their playing favorites, and it's obviously upsetting a lot of indie devs. I think this is mostly a non-issue that will go away within a year, but I do think right now it could be an issue and something that we need to discuss. Now, before we dive into this, I want to remind you we are giving away 5 copies of Donkey Kong Bonanza. You can enter in the link down in the pinned comment or the description. But let's go ahead and dive into this article at GameIndustry.biz. This whole video is about this article because there's a lot of quotes in here from indie developers dealing with Switch 2 dev kits. So it says, where are the Switch 2 indie games? Indie developers and publishers discuss the lack of access to Switch 2 dev kits. So I want to note, we're only like in the 3rd week or so of the Switch 2 even being on the market. So, a lot of developers didn't have dev kits heading into June because most companies, PlayStation 5 and Xbox included, were not handing out dev kits to most indie devs until after the system came out. So I want to be very clear, it hasn't even been out for a month. Okay, keep that context in mind as we read this article. So we scroll down here and it says, I would like Citizen Sleeper 2 to have been on Switch 2 at launch, but that wasn't possible, says Gareth Damian Martin. They're not the only indie developer that wasn't invited to the Switch 2 party. Looking at the current list of titles for Nintendo's latest console, there are very few games from indie devs. Deltarune and No Man's Sky are among the lucky ones that managed to get past the velvet rope. Tony Gowland from the Edinburgh-based indie studio Ant Workshop says the slow cadence of releases is typical for any console launch, a time when development kits for new machines are usually in short supply. So again, as I said, this is completely normal, okay? So why are there complaints? Well, let's get into this. So in terms of dev kit availability, there's been a similar situation with the original Switch, which was also like a hen's teeth for a good 6 to 7 months after launch, he says. Ant Workshop released its first Switch game, Binaries, in September of 2017, many months after the console's March 2017 debut. Backwards compatibility. Gowland thinks that in terms of sending out Switch 2 dev kits, Nintendo is prioritizing titles that wouldn't be doable on the previous console. The indie folks I know who have been successful in getting kits are working on games that are in need of the Switch 2's extra oomph, he says. I believe, due to the comprehensive backwards compatibility, he continues, Nintendo's current priority is to provide kits for titles that don't have an OG Switch version in the works. At least that was the impression I got when we reached out about Into the Restless Runes. We have contact in Nintendo for comment, and we'll update this article if we hear back. The vast majority of Switch titles work just fine on Switch 2. But of course, those developers and publishers without access to Switch 2 dev kits haven't had a way to test compatibility before the console's launch. Damian Martin was relieved when they booted up Citizen Sleeper 2 on the new console. Thankfully, the game runs in 4K on Switch 2, they say, but this was news to me on launch day. The waiting game. Chris Wright, founder and managing director of Fellow Traveler, the publisher of Citizen Sleeper 2, along with titles like 1000 X Resist and Afterlove EP, says that they don't currently have access to Switch 2 dev kits. It's understandable that dev kits are heavily restricted before a console launch, and they usually remain restricted for a while afterwards, he says. The Switch 2 has been very much normal in this regard, and we didn't expect to have access to dev kits ahead of launch. Naturally, he would have liked to bring Fellow Traveler games to Switch 2 on day one. We're really keen to use things like the mouse controls in particular, he says. Games like Citizen Sleeper will benefit from having mouse controls on the console. But he also acknowledged that it's not very practical for Nintendo to send out thousands of dev kits ahead of launch for a highly secretive new platform. Like most indie developers and publishers, he found out the details of Switch 2 at the same time as the general public. That's par for the course for a new console, he says. It's pretty normal for things to be kept on a need-to-know basis. But now the Switch 2 has been out in the wild for weeks. Oh my God, guys, we're still in the month it launched. Switch 2 launched this month. Okay. He still doesn't have an idea of when Fellow Traveler might receive some dev kits. We have basically very little information on when they'll be available. What we would like to see in the short term is communication and clarity to indies on what we can expect in terms of when and how access to kits will open up. We're very keen to support the platform, knowing a timeline would allow us to plan for that. So engine support. The good news for indies is that support for Switch 2 is already in place for the two leading game engines, Unity and Unreal. In fact, Unity developed its first game in 20 years as a Switch 2 exclusive. Andrew Dennison, the head of Unity Studio Productions, said the development of Survival Kids gave Unity a chance to emulate what our customers go through and verify how the engine worked during the production of an actual Switch 2 title. Switch 2 support is available through a Unity plugin for those with access to Switch 2 Development Kit. Unreal is also ready to go. Switch 2 provides a real opportunity for Unreal Engine developers to use it, as UE5 support is in place from the start, says Terrence Burns, co-founder and CTO of Unreal Engine external development studio Tanglewood Games in Hartlepool. Unlike the original Switch, Unreal Engine 5's tech stack is fully supported on Switch 2, he says, which means that there's plenty of scope for the new titles to be developed, and it's also easier for developers to consider porting Xbox Series X or PS5 titles to the platform. There will likely be a few active decisions needed about scaling down in some areas, given that still slightly handheld limited spec of the Switch 2, but it will mean fewer major content changes, which would compromise core game elements. It's notable, however, that Tanglewood still doesn't have access to its own Switch 2 dev kit. So, a peek behind the curtain. Another game engine that has Switch 2 compatibility is the 2D-centric Game Maker, developed by the Dundee-based Yo-Yo Games. The engine is used for the Switch 2 launch title, Deltarune. Game Maker's senior product manager, Russell Kay, says they've been working on a Switch 2 support for about a year. There was a lot of security around it, he says. We had to have a locked room, things like that, and only certain people had access to the kit. Because there was a limited number of developers granted access to this, I actually ended up doing most of the work myself. He says that Nintendo had a very mature hardware product at the time Game Maker got involved. The main changes he's seen with Switch 2 during the time he's been working with Nintendo have been around the process and admin side of things in terms of things like submission guidelines. They hadn't quite finished some of those guidelines at certain points. We had to wait until they decided, oh, no, this is how we're going to do it. In order for a developer to use a Switch 2 development tool in Game Maker, he says the Dundee company has to confirm with Nintendo that the developer has access to a Switch 2 dev kit. We can't just take somebody's word for it, he says. If Nintendo provides confirmation, Game Maker can then unlock access to the Switch 2 menu. Naturally, this means Kay knows exactly how many developers are working on Switch 2 games in Game Maker, although he can't reveal that number. But when asked whether Switch 2 dev kits are in short supply, he has this to say: Nintendo have been keeping cards close to their chest. We now know of a few other developers who have Switch 2 access, and we are working with them just now, but they have not opened the floodgates yet. So we're really just waiting for that in terms of how Nintendo are planning on opening the gates to all other developers. We don't know what their plan is in terms of access, he adds. We're not party to what Nintendo are actually planning. Now the year ahead. At launch, the original Switch became something of a haven for indie developers. Its relative lack of graphical oomph actually worked in the indie devs' favor, meaning that they could avoid competing against big-budget, graphically spectacular titles on the platform. But the Switch's success also saw its eShop become gradually swamped with shovelware, leading to discoverability crisis. This has been addressed somewhat with the new eShop on Switch 2, which offers improvements like better navigation and personalized recommendations. However, the Switch 2's improved specs also mean indies will see competition from games like Cyberpunk 2077, which took the lion's share of third-party game sales at the console launch. In addition, the game industry's landscape is markedly different in 2025 compared to 8 years ago. Whereas once Nintendo had the handheld market almost all to itself, now customers have various PC handhelds to choose from, like Steam Deck, the ROG Xbox Ally. It's possible that these will become the preferred target for indie titles, and I just gotta say something about every time I see PC handhelds brought up as like this major competitor for Switch 2, I don't think people quite understand what's happening. In 4 days, Nintendo Switch 2 sold north of 3.5 million units. That is more than the reported total sales of Steam Deck since it came out 3 years ago. And Steam Deck is the number one selling portable PC handle. I don't really feel like indies are intentionally targeting these PC handhelds. They're just targeting PC, and they just happen to run on those handhelds. That's the way most games work on the PC handhelds. They're not targeting the PC handhelds. They're targeting PC. And then if they're within spec, they can run on those handhelds. Switch 2 has to actually be targeted for. So I don't agree with this statement at all in this article. Not only is it not really competition, Also, they're not targeting those platforms specifically in the first place. They're just targeting PCs in general. Meanwhile, many indie developers and publishers are still waiting for the Switch 2 dev kits to arrive. Our hope is that they get to it basically and roll this stuff out quickly, says Wright. Otherwise, he worries about game pipeline for Nintendo's console. What does next year look like, he asks? Are we going to see a dearth of new content? Is it going to take a couple of years before there's that wider access leading to releases? We'd love them to maybe speed things up a little bit now that the launch is done and get some communications out there and some paths for more indies to start getting kits. We asked Kay whether he shares developer concerns about a potential slow rollout of Switch 2 dev kits. And he says, I wouldn't be too worried because all Switch games effectively work on Switch 2. There's a large catalog of games already coming to Switch 1. Nintendo have done probably the best thing that they can. This time next year, it won't be a worry for anyone at all. This time next year, there'll be full Switch 2 games coming out. So basically, Nintendo is playing favorites, right? They are favoring the developers that need the extra oomph to make games exclusively for Switch 2 or mostly exclusively for Switch 2. And they are not necessarily opening the floodgates yet. Again, 3 weeks into June, not opening the floodgates yet for all indie developers to have access. Guys, this to me is really par for the course. As was noted, like, as there's some frustration from certain indie developers, some of them understand that, like, this is just normal. This is what happens with PlayStation. It's what happens with Xbox, happened with Switch. It's happening with Switch 2. There's a slow rollout. It's probably going to take until the end of this year before Nintendo really has things opened up for pretty much anyone who wants a dev kit to get one, as long as you're a legit game developer. So, yeah, I do think that this is much to do about nothing. I think that, while I can understand the frustration of indie developers being like, oh, we would have loved to have our games ready day one. Look, it's probably better your game wasn't. There was already 24 launch games, one of the biggest day one launch libraries in console history. Probably want to spread stuff out. You're going to want your releases spread out. So I'm not worried about like the future of indie games on Switch 2. I don't think that is something to worry about. That's like saying we were worried about the future of indie games on Switch back in the day when it took 6 to 7 months before all indie devs could get it. Again, to me, this is like much to do about nothing. It is nice to hear some of the background of the industry and how there are concerns about it, but I think the concerns are just people want to catch on to the Switch 2 hype train, right? I think that's what's going on. Like, obviously, as content creators, we try to latch onto the hype train, whether it's in a negative way, a positive way, or a neutral way. There's obviously game developers. They want to hitch on to that wagon as well. Cyberpunk 2077 has seen a huge boost in sales, in large part thanks to Switch 2 worldwide. Yeah, that was CD Projekt Red taking advantage of a console launch and being one of the most talked about games for that console. That's going to lead to people probably wanting to buy a Witcher 3 Switch 2 edition. That's probably going to lead to people maybe being interested in Witcher 4 when it comes out, because CD Projekt Red is building that reputation early and often on Switch 2. And a lot of companies want to do that. They want to be that company that can build faith in the core audience behind Switch 2 so that they buy their games when they come out in the future. And I understand from an indie developer perspective, you want to be that go-to indie developer. You want to be like the Fast Fusion team, right? You want to be like them. They made an exclusive game for Switch 2, which is why they had a dev kit. It is interesting as well that the game maker people have had a dev kit for a year, and they basically said nothing really changed in the year besides behind the scenes processes on how you submit games and get approval. I do think that that's interesting because that also means the specs have been finalized for a long time, which is why so many of the leaks from the last like 2 years have been true, because things have been finalized for a while. But anyways, it's just much to do about nothing in the end. This video, you could argue this video doesn't need to exist, but I do think it's important to point out that, one, some things happening behind the scenes, two, that there are indie developers frustrated, and three, that this is completely normal. So when I see headlines out there like Nintendo's playing favorites, yeah, no shit. Of course they're playing favorites. What did we expect exactly? Did we expect Nintendo to just give everyone dev kits just because the system's out? Like, they probably don't have just like thousands and thousands and thousands of dev kits just sitting in a warehouse ready to send out, right? They probably make them on demand, and they realize what the demand is, and they're probably making more of those dev kits, and they will get them out when the time is right. Obviously, I assume they've sent out some dev kits since the system came out, but it's going to be a slow rollout. It's going to be a while until Nintendo has all the processes in place where anyone that wants a dev kit can get it. Because right now, priority is probably the AAA like ramping up the AAA ones, because I know personally there are certain AAA studios that only have like 2 or 3 dev kits, and they have so many different teams making games. They need a lot more of those. Wouldn't be shocked if once June came and the system came out, a lot of the dev kits they had stacked up ended up being sent out to those AAA third parties instead, which probably was the case with Nintendo Switch as well, probably the case with PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series, where a majority of the dev kits post-launch are going to the AAAs, and when they start to get that next batch, the huge wave, some months from now, they start to open it up to the indie devs. It's just the way it is. So I'm not worried about games next year. As the article notes at the end, the one person says, hey, by this time next year, June next year, we're not going to be talking about this. Everyone's going to be able to get a dev kit. So anyways, it is interesting, though, that Nintendo had some restrictions there about like locking it in a room and only select people could know about it, as we found out from the Deltarune devs. I think that's kind of interesting. Look, a lot of the leaks we got didn't come like from developers. So I guess in that sense, it worked out. A lot of leaks came from manufacturing. So anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I am Nathaniel Rebel Jans from Nintendo Prime. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video.